Today, we're going to talk about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. This is a dark topic, and if fire or loss of life is extremely upsetting to you, you may wish to stop listening now. New York City, 1911. The Civil War is a shadow in the rearview mirror. The Great Depression and the World Wars not yet quite on the horizon. America was a country struggling towards modernity, both socially and industrially. In the great rush toward urbanization and greater industrialization, workers' rights were only now starting to become an issue that captured the public. Unions and collective bargaining were picking up steam, and women did not yet have the right to vote, though the suffrage movement was in full swing and had been for some time. Amid this struggle toward what we would later recognize as basic human rights, cities like New York were awash in hopeful immigrants. They came largely from southern Italy and Russian Jewish ghettos, fleeing terrible conditions in their home countries, moving toward what they had hoped would be a better life, employment, opportunity, a little hope for the future, for their families. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company was a sweatshop in Lower Manhattan. They manufactured shirtwaists, a type of women's top that was popular at the time. The conditions were cramped and dirty, the pay was lousy, and the owners were crooked. On the late afternoon of Saturday, March 25th, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory ignited in a blaze that would change the course of American labor rights. In just 18 minutes, it would see 146 lives ended in a fire that would haunt New York for years to come. Here's what happened. Due to processes engineered during the Civil War, Americans had, for the first time, gotten a taste for well-fitting, mass-produced clothing. With the advent of modern sewing machines and the increase in immigration, everything that was needed to change the clothing industry was in place: technology and cheap labor. In 1900, Isaac Harris and Max Blanc opened the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. They manufactured shirtwaists, a popular garment for women that allowed greater comfort and freedom of movement than more old-fashioned women's clothing. Using mechanical sewing machines and the cutting knife, they were able to produce 5 times more product than other sweatshops. But make no mistake, that's exactly what they were: a sweatshop. Conditions in their building were claustrophobic, dirty, and often dark. These places were also vectors for disease and sickness, which would easily spread through workers. The laborers at the factory were expected to work between 80 and 100 hours per week and were paid between $3 and $15 per week, though 15 was rare, and $7 per week was closer to the median wage. Worse, the workers, after spending grueling hours in these unsafe conditions, would find that the very thread and needles they had used in the sewing machines were deducted from their own paychecks by the owners. These horrors and abuses allowed extreme profits, and Harris and Blanc became very wealthy men. By 1902, they moved out of their original shop and opened the Triangle Factory. They rented out the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building in Greenwich Village, Lower Manhattan. Ostensibly, this should have been a safer place for the workers. Many buildings at the time were wooden structures, whereas the Ash Building was advertised as ultra-modern. It was made of steel and iron. The designers of the building even tempted fate by advertising it as fireproof. Though the building was larger and supposedly fireproof, conditions were not much better for the workers there. There was poor ventilation, bad lighting, and incredibly narrow stairwells leading to the only exits from the building. There was an elevator and a fire escape, though the fire escape was narrow, poorly constructed, and, bizarrely, it ended 10 feet off of the ground above a basement skylight. Absurd as it seems, since there were no laws or regulatory bodies for safety at the time, the building was considered a step forward from the old tenement structures that the sweatshops were housed in. Harris and Blanc continued to modernize towards profits, with the pair designing specialized tables for the fabric cutters. These long, broad tables were meant for cutting large swaths of fabric to be used in clothing manufacturing. And to save time, Blanc and Harris built massive waste bins beneath each table. That way, scraps of processed cotton and tracing paper could simply be swept beneath the table and handled later. Because of this, there were hundreds of pounds of cotton and paper loosely packed together beneath every table in the factory. Altogether, thousands of pounds of material. But while technology marched forward, Blanc and Harris continued to treat their workers poorly. The cramped conditions were still a cause of constant sickness, and they were obsessed with the idea that their employees might be stealing from them. Even though they were making the equivalent of millions of dollars today, they were worried about losing a little bit of fabric and thread. They checked every woman's bag at the door to make sure she wasn't taking anything, and they even locked the secondary exit to make sure that no one could sneak any cotton or thread out the back door. Harris and Blanc did everything they could to prevent their employees from fighting for better conditions. They created a fake, in-house labor union that was run by their own relatives. They even designed the factory floor layouts to make it more difficult for workers to speak to each other and to keep them in greater isolation. But it didn't work. In 1909, the horrible conditions of the factory and how terribly the workers were treated caused what is known as a wildcat strike. The workers had no union and no collective bargaining power, but they went on strike anyway. They picketed the factory to prevent scab workers from entering, effectively shutting down production at the Triangle factory. A bold young woman named Clara Lemlich was the head of the New York Garment Workers Union at the time, and she was trying to get the Triangle factory into the union. They had such wild and unreasonable demands as a 52-hour work week, and that the thread for the machines not be taken out of their own paychecks. By this time, Blanc and Harris were insanely wealthy by the standards of the day, but rather than share the wealth with their workforce, they fought tooth and nail against them. They threatened to fire anyone who joined the Garment Workers Union, and in a terrifying show of their true colors, they hired a cadre of New York pimps and prostitutes as strikebreakers. They assaulted the women who were picketing and severely battered them. Due to the rampant corruption of the mayor's office at the time and the police force, police, pimps, and prostitutes were often working together to assault and batter striking workers from the factory. Each time the police would arrest the picketing workers, wealthy New York suffragettes would go down to the police station and bail them out. Slowly, public sentiment began to shift and turn against Blanc and Harris. Seeing women beaten half to death in the streets over and over will do that. The paper started writing articles and showing pictures of battered workers who would talk about the conditions inside the sweatshop factory. Rather than give in, Blanc and Harris launched a counteroffensive. They paid a New York Times journalist to write a puff piece for them about how happy the scab workers are to be working for the Triangle factory, and how the only reason the workers are upset is because outside agitators had tricked the poor immigrant working women who didn't know any better. These strikes happened off and on for 2 years, all through 1909 and 1910. But Blanc and Harris were increasingly agitated by them, not just because of the loss of profits, but they actually considered it a personal insult. You see, by the standards of the day, the Triangle factory was relatively safe and modern. They found it a personal affront that the workers would dare to unionize when they had gone to, in their minds, extreme lengths to ensure their safety and comfort. They started taking more extreme and bizarre measures. With much of their workforce being Italian immigrants, they started hiring Italian parish priests to come in during work hours and give sermons about how workers have a religious duty to be obedient. They also tried a tactic that we still see echoes of today in the modern office pizza party. They decided to host dance parties during the lunch breaks that you were only invited to if you were one of the workers who didn't go on strike. There were even prizes to be won. Though, I can't imagine that what I want to do on my brief lunch break in my 14-hour workday is dance. They probably should have just paid them. As these strikes stretched on, eventually New York judges grew angry at the wealthy suffragettes who were bailing out workers, and so they started to sentence the workers to hard labor in penal colonies instead. Sometimes they had to do weeks of hard labor in terrible conditions just because they went out on strike. Thankfully, their time working in the Triangle factory meant that for many of them, this was no great hardship. They were used to hard labor in terrible conditions. Eventually, Blanc and Harris broke down and gave in to many of the demands being made. Pay raises and a standard 52-hour work week were instituted. They did refuse one key demand of the strikers, to become a union-only factory, but the majority of demands were granted. Production at the Triangle factory resumed, with workers getting more reasonable hours and better pay. As I mentioned earlier, the cutting tables on the factory floor were stuffed with thousands of pounds of cotton and tissue paper. As such, things like smoking, which was incredibly common at the time, were understandably banned inside the factory. But small fires had happened before anyway. Blanc and Harris took some measures against this. Buckets of water were placed around the factory floor for dousing fires, and there was a small hose that was meant for the same purpose. While this sounds somewhat reasonable, it's important to understand the two things that they refused to do. The first was that they refused to put their employees through any sort of fire drills. They had no policy or plan in place for what to do in the event of a major fire. Secondly, they didn't have sprinkler systems. While we may think of sprinklers as being a fairly modern invention, they were in fact widely available at the time. Even the cotton processing plants that worked with the materials used in the factory had to, by law, have sprinklers, firewalls, and fire doors. But these laws did not extend to the garment factories. Some people suspect that these oversights were intentional on the part of Blanc and Harris. You see, the garment tycoons had several suspiciously convenient fires in the past. Several times at the end of their busy season and when no workers were in the building, their excess material stock that they could no longer use caught ablaze. It burned up completely, harming no one and giving Blanc and Harris a large insurance payout for the materials that they no longer wanted anyway. This happened several times. Of course, if they'd had a sprinkler system installed, this would have been impossible. And so they didn't buy one, since they wanted to continue using this method of getting rid of old material stock. On March 25th, roughly 600 workers were inside the Triangle factory as it closed up for the day. The fire started at one of the cutting tables, of course. In addition to hundreds of pounds of processed cotton and paper stored beneath it, as part of the closing procedure for the day, the table had been set up to be ready for the next day's work. That meant it had over 120 layers of fabric and paper on top of it. Though we do not know for sure, it's believed that one of the factory workers decided to smoke on the floor despite the risks. It's unknown if it was an errant spark from the lighting of a match, if the match was tossed carelessly away, or if the cigarette itself was not fully snuffed before being discarded. Regardless, one of the massive waste bins beneath the cutting tables found a spark. The combination of fabric, paper, and pockets of air was perfect for creating a massive, fast-moving wall of fire. The conflagration moved with startling speed. Workers tried to use buckets of water to contain the blaze, but of course that was useless. And on top of that, Many of the fire safety buckets were found to actually be empty. They had no water in them. When workers went to retrieve the hose to help hold off the blaze while people evacuated, they found that the hose length was rotted through and that the valve was rusted shut. It couldn't be used. Shy of a sprinkler system that Harris and Blanc never purchased, there probably would have been no way to effectively fight a fire with so much fuel. And so, terrified, people began to flee. But of course, there was no fire evacuation plan, no drills, and orderly and swift evacuation would have saved lives, though the workers would shortly realize just how stacked against them the odds were. The best way to exit would be the elevator, but the elevator could only hold a dozen people at a time. The heroic elevator operator made 4 trips up and down the blazing elevator shaft with flames licking at his heels before the elevator broke down. Several of the mechanisms melted, preventing any further trips. The women who had been waiting for the elevator to return for more eventually realized it was never going to. Hemmed in by fire, they attempted to jump to the bottom of the elevator shaft to escape. The bodies of 36 women were found at the bottom of the elevator shaft. Many workers fled down the narrow, winding, and smoke-filled stairwells toward the exits. Of course, any who chose to try to leave via the back door found that they were locked inside. Harris and Blanc kept the factory door locked to prevent theft. Dozens of bodies were found, stacked against the locked door in the aftermath. 49 workers found themselves suffocated, burned, and crushed to death at the locked door. Those who fled to the windows of the factory to get help from the New York Fire Department were met with just as bad a fate. The fire department at the time had no way of getting water into the building to the fire, and the ladders on their trucks stretched no higher than the 6th floor. The fire department could not help to evacuate the Triangle factory. Help was not coming. As crowds formed below and people watched from the streets, workers were forced to make a decision whether they wished to burn and suffocate or to jump. 58 people died by jumping out of the factory windows to the streets of Lower Manhattan, in front of a crowd of helpless onlookers. Those who fled to the rickety, poorly manufactured fire escape also found themselves unlikely to make it to safety, with the fire escape ending 10 feet above the ground and above a basement skylight. Several people were killed via impalement trying to flee through this route, and eventually the fire escape collapsed. The Triangle Fire burned for only 18 minutes. In that time, 146 workers, primarily young immigrant women, were killed. The outrage over what happened was immediate and powerful. The wealthy tycoons fought this by engaging in a mass marketing campaign to polish their image as safe and reliable garment manufacturers. Once again, the New York Times ran an article on their behalf, meeting Harris at his mansion and reporting on his claims that he had taken all of the possible and necessary precautions. Despite the locked factory doors, the lack of sprinklers, fire drills, and the poor maintenance done on what little firefighting equipment they did have. The empty buckets and rotted hose. But neither an advertising campaign nor a New York Times puff piece could do anything to stem the tide of public outrage. Both men were indicted on manslaughter charges. However, at the time of the fire, there were no safety features required by law in factories. So the case came down to whether or not it was illegal for the 2 men to block the factory exit. Blanc and Harris's very well-paid lawyer poked holes in the prosecution's story by making it look as if they had rehearsed their testimony ahead of time. In the end, it took only 2 hours of deliberation for a jury to return a verdict of not guilty. The verdict caused such public outrage that Blanc and Harris had to sneak out of the courthouse to safety. Almost immediately, the tycoons went about the business of trying to rebuild the Triangle factory. But this was a lost cause. Public sentiment had soured on the brand, and people were so furious over what had happened and the lack of accountability that sales from Triangle dropped steeply. Harris and Blanc began to struggle financially since they no longer had a source of income, and they owed tremendous debts to the legal team that had gotten them off the hook. But even that didn't last. Late in 1912, Harris and Blanc received the insurance payout for the Triangle factory. They had been heavily overinsured. They collected $60,000, a staggering amount of money in 1912, and more than the fire had actually cost them in damages. The court did order them to pay damages to the families of those who died, however, but only a week's salary to each. In short, about $10 to the families of each of the 146 workers who had perished in the disastrous and tragic fire. In total, around $1,460 out of the $60,000 that they had been paid out by insurance companies. All said and done, Blanc and Harris themselves profited about $400 per human life. They ended up making a significant profit from this entirely avoidable disaster, and in the process, they learned absolutely nothing from their mistakes. In 1913, 2 years after the fire, and 1 year after being paid out by insurance, Blanc was issued a warning by an inspector at his new factory. The violation? He had locked the factory doors to prevent workers from stealing, meaning that they would not be able to exit in the case of a fire. The fine he was issued for having done this, the punishment for showing that he had learned absolutely nothing except how to profit from the grievous loss of human life, $20. Several months later, he would be fined an additional $20 for another fire safety violation. In 1918, they finally shut down the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. It just never became very profitable again. Isaac Harris went back to his work as a tailor, and Max Blanc moved on to owning more garment factories under a different name. Neither man experienced anything that a reasonable person might call justice. Thankfully, though, there was something learned from this tragedy, even if not by the owners of the Triangle Company. On the day of the fire in 1912, standing outside the factory and watching with horror as women chose again and again to jump to their deaths from the windows was a young woman named Frances Perkins. The event she saw that day would stay with her for the rest of her life, and she would devote herself to making sure that workers were safe. Every accident that could be avoided would be, and when they couldn't be, help would be coming. Eventually, Frances Perkins became the Secretary of Labor under Franklin D. Roosevelt. In that position, she established the Factory Investigation Commission, which lobbied for stronger safety measures and inspectors to make sure that the measures were implemented. She served in that role for 12 years, helping to reform safety, worker conditions, and even to push through the establishment of a minimum wage. She also supported the rights of workers to unionize and collectively bargain, all issues that were instrumental in the run-up to the terrible disaster at the Triangle factory. Perkins also later established the Labor Standards Bureau, which focused on making sure all employers meet minimum safety standards. Years later, in 1970, it was this bureau that became OSHA, a cornerstone of modern workplace safety and worker protections. To quote Frances Perkins about what she saw that day, "I remember, we heard the engines and we heard the screams, and we rushed out and rushed over. We could see this building from Washington Square, and the people had just begun to jump when we got there. They had been standing in the windowsills, crowded by others behind them, the fire pressing closer and closer, the smoke closer and closer. Finally, the men were trying to get out this net to catch people. They couldn't wait any longer. They began to jump. The window was too crowded, and they would jump and they would hit the sidewalk. The net broke. They fell a terrible distance. The weight of the bodies was so great that they broke through the net. Every one of them was killed. Everybody who jumped. It was a horrifying spectacle. We felt as though we had all been a part of it. Thank you for listening. This has been A Troubled Past. If you'd like to hear more stories like this one, please subscribe and follow us on social media. Let me know in the comments what you think of Max Blanc and Isaac Harris. Did they neglect the fire safety measures on purpose? Maybe. Maybe not. But the cost in human lives is undeniable. Should there have been a criminal sentence for them? What do you think? And please, drop a comment as well if there are other stories you would like to see me cover.